Okay, so why do we talk about number and time together? The unit for today is, of course, known as timing and number, um, and that's how it's displayed in any kind of animal cognition textbook. And why is that? Well, they're about discriminating magnitude. Whether you're discriminating between two durations of time or two different amounts of objects, they both share the common feature that they're both instances of discriminating magnitude. The other idea here is that animals sometimes and often keep track of both number and time simultaneously. An example of an experiment showing that animals time and or discriminate between duration and discriminate between magnitude in a similar way is shown in this experiment. So what you're looking at here, each hill is basically a stimulus and its duration. So how long it is its duration. Okay, so what they did here was they presented rats with either 2 or 8 bursts of noise that were 1 second each. So you can see that there, either 2 or 8. And then reward could be obtained if the rats pressed one lever, if 2 bursts had occurred, and another lever if 8 bursts had occurred. Okay? So in this situation, both number and time covary. 2 bursts take 2 seconds, and 8 bursts take 8 seconds. So that's the training that we see at the top. And then after, they test either for number or for timing. So on trials testing number, either 2 or 8 bursts were played, but each occurred over 4 seconds. So you can see that there at the top. And then on the trials, or in the middle I should say, and then on the trials testing timing, 4 bursts were played over either 2 or 8 seconds. So the important thing here, the interesting thing here, is that regardless of which dimension they were tested on, the rats stayed accurate. They always responded with the long lever for 8 seconds or 8 bursts and the short lever for 2 seconds or 2 bursts. So this is evidence showing that numerical processing, or processing of amount, of magnitude, I shouldn't say numerical, is similar to time processing. All right, now let's go on and talk about discriminating numbers of responses, okay? So humans are still pretty good at knowing how many times an event has happened, even if they weren't able to count it. So if you ask a person to hit a key as many times as possible, they still have a pretty good sense of how many times they responded, even if they weren't allowed to count, right? And rats can keep track of their responses as well. So if in one study they had rats pressing a lever a certain amount of times, but it had to be a specific number before they would do another behavior, they would place their head into a food tray to receive a reward. So they have to hit the lever a certain amount of times, put their head in the correct location, and then they get a reward. And they're pretty good at that, okay? But even in humans and rats, there's still variability. So key presses in humans and lever presses in rats are not always going to be exact. And as the amount of, as the magnitude increases, it gets more difficult. And this actually follows Weber's law that we talked about a while ago now. So the number estimates are not perfect without counting, and of course there is more variability for larger numbers in both rats and in humans. So a theme that's come up relatively often in the course is how you can't just ask animals questions linguistically, right? We can't just ask them how many O's are in this picture, or does this picture have more O's than X's? If you ask a person this question, you'd be able to see pretty easily that in the bottom figure there's more zeros than there are X's. So we have to design experiments to kind of get at that question without asking the animals linguistically, because they simply wouldn't understand, right? So here is an example of trying to test numerosity in pigeons. So when they peck, or when they are shown the zeros here, they get a reward. When they're shown the X's, they get no reward. And then you test them with conflicting information, right? So here we're trying to see, can they tell that there's actually more O's than there are X's? You'd expect them to peck if they can count, right? Because it's more like one stimulus than the other stimulus. This kind of skill, numerosity, in animals, you can imagine would be pretty important, actually. No, animals don't need to necessarily count, but it would be really useful to know how many animals there are in a rival pack, or which patch of food has more food, right? Discriminating number is pretty important. And so I asked you earlier about this array down here, right, with where it says testing. You could tell almost immediately that there's more zeros than there are X's. And this is something called relative numerosity. So you can't immediately tell how many zeros there are, how many X's there are, but you can still tell that there are more zeros than there are X's, right? So having the ability of relative numerosity is pretty important. Okay, so let's go through an example of using this kind of procedure to test numerosity in pigeons. So it's kind of a classic example of relative numerosity discrimination. And what they did was they trained pigeons to peck at an array of red dots. Okay, so that's the correct. And then if they were given blue dots, they don't get a reward, right? So once the pigeons figure this out, red is correct, blue is incorrect, what they do is they would give them test trials with an array of mixed dots, right? So here you can see there's clearly more red dots than there are blue dots, but the experimenters want to see how did the pigeons respond when they're given this kind of information. Can they tell that there's more red than there is blue? So what they found was that pigeons' rate of responding was directly related to the proportion of red dots. So pigeons pecked more frequently if there were more red dots than blue dots, and the responding increased as the number of red dots increased and decreased as the number of blue dots increased. Now, something to keep in mind with this, though, so, initially that might seem like a pretty cool result, right? Okay, pigeons can count in a sense that they have relative numerosity, right? The other thing, though, is that it could be that they're sensitive to surface area here, right? More of the surface area is red than it is blue. The thing is, in nature, surface area and number are pretty highly correlated, right? But when we're looking directly at numerosity, there is a difference between distinct objects, right, counting number, and the amount of surface area something is taking place. So they redid this experiment, they did follow-up experiments, and they tried to control for surface area in many ways. So they altered the size of the dots, they used different, like they might have used X's and O's like we saw earlier, but they still found that pigeons kind of had the same pattern of results, where they would peck more frequently if there were more red than blue in this example, and the responding increased as the number of correct stimuli were also increased. Okay, and here's an image kind of illustrating that concept of number versus surface area. So if you look in the first row, all of these objects have the same number of dots. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dots, right? All the same, but you can see that the surface areas are different along that row. Now, if you look at the same surface area row, all of those circles in the boxes, they have the same surface area, but there's clearly a different number, right? So in nature, like I said, number and surface area are pretty highly correlated, right? But they're still distinct. They are different. Number is different from surface area. Okay, so those examples we just looked at, they involve quite a bit of training, right? A pigeon has to be trained in a lab on an operant task. We've talked about this a little bit, about different tasks, but it's kind of an artificial situation. And again, it also relies heavily on training. Still very powerful, very useful. We can see that pigeons do have this ability, right? They have this relative numerosity ability, as well as other animals too, right? But do animals have this natural ability? Do they have something known as spontaneous numerosity discrimination? So can they still discriminate number without a ton of training in a lab? Really, the question here is number salient? Is there a spontaneous use of number? So one way that researchers try to investigate this spontaneous numerosity was a study with rhesus monkeys, and they were given a delayed match to sample task. So we've talked about delayed match to sample tasks before, but basically here, matches could be made based on number or on one other dimension. And all of the monkeys had previous experience with delayed match to sample tasks, but not all had previous experience in tasks that used number as key information. So here's some examples of what that could look like. So here, the experimenters are looking at number versus shape, right? So the sample, 2 circles in both the standard trials and the probe trials. So the probe trials are the interesting trials, right? And on the standard trial, you can see there's 2 different choices. So either 2 more circles, which would clearly be the correct choice, or 4 lightning bolts, okay? So here they're looking at shape. The probe trial, though, they're given 2 choices. Okay, are the animals looking at the shape, the circles? Are they going to choose the circles, or are they going to pick the number of lightning bolts? And what they found was that the monkeys made their choices based on number over shape. Another example here with color. Again, the monkeys pick the number over the conflicting color. Lastly, the one that is potentially the most interesting, number versus surface area, or I shouldn't say it's the most interesting, but it's the most interesting in order to know, is it numerosity or is it just surface area, right? We talked about that a little bit just now. Again, though, the monkeys show a preference for choosing the correct number, not necessarily the same surface area. Okay, so what are some mechanisms for this approximate number system? One of them is known as the analog magnitude representation view. So this is a cognitive model of our approximate number system, where the real world value is represented in the mind as a sort of analog of that real world value. So it's a noisy representation of the set of items, but still proportional to the number of items being represented. Another view is the information processing or accumulator model that we talked about earlier when we were talking about timing. So this would work in a very similar way to how we discussed it in timing, but an alternative model proposes that events or objects are detected in parallel and not incrementally with a pacemaker. Then they are summed to form an analog representation. So there's the analog magnitude representation, there's information processing accumulator model. In response to the information processing model, there's kind of a parallel view of this processing. But one thing that's not really in dispute is Weber's law. So the performance of both humans and animals is predicted by Weber's law. So we know that across humans and non-human animals, larger ratios are always easier to discriminate than smaller ones. And smaller numbers are easier to discriminate as different than when you're comparing two very large numbers, right? So these two little pieces of evidence here are relevant in the fact that they're related to Weber's law, and we see Weber's law showing up in these judgments of magnitude in both timing and in number. It's much easier to discriminate 3 versus 4 than it is 8 versus 9. When you looked at these two images, it was probably instantaneous that you could tell that one circle has 3 circles and the other circle has 4 circles. But you might actually have to individually count the dots in the second box there to show that one circle has 9 circles and the other one has 8. This corresponds quite nicely and aligns with Weber's law. You can see that shown here. Each little distribution that you're looking at, think of that as a range of responses from a participant. And the number on the top is the amount of dots a participant was shown. So 4 dots, 5 dots, 6 dots, 7, 8, 9, or 10. And you can see that as the number increases, there's a wider range in responses. So if you're shown 8 dots, sometimes you might say 6 or 10, but that's not really going to happen as often. There's going to be less error when you're shown fewer dots. When you're shown 4, you'll always get 4 right? There's not going to be as much error going on there. Again, this is Weber's law in action. We can think back too with that example of with the pigeons in the timing, right? We see those kind of properties, Weber's law properties. And again, timing and number might work on very similar mechanisms because they both have something to do with magnitude. So are there the same mechanisms for timing and number? Well, we do know that infants show similar development for interval timing and for a sense of number. And we also both know that timing and number conform to Weber's law. There are also similar neural processes for timing and number. So again, when we're talking about magnitude, so that includes size as well as loudness. You're thinking about the amount of something. So what you're looking at here is a researcher who wrote a review paper. So they're looking at many, many different findings. And what they noticed was that the parietal cortex seems particularly important in our judgments of magnitude. So they did a review of a variety of different neural studies that were looking at magnitude in different ways. So brightness, number, ordinal memory. So these are lists, ordinal position, size, and time. And they're showing where in the brain those different measures of magnitude seem to be important. And you can see that they're all in the parietal cortex and they're kind of clustered in the same area, right? So it could be that the neural mechanisms for magnitude are all in the parietal cortex, and that it's a similar system for all of these different types of magnitude, including time and number. Okay, so we've talked about this approximate number system, and we've highlighted that magnitude is kind of the important factor there. We can see how this might be adaptive, being able to tell one set of stimuli has more than the other is useful in many different contexts. When we're talking about food, talking about other conspecifics that are your enemies, when we're talking about prey, we're talking about predators, it all makes sense to be able to make magnitude judgments. This bush has more berries than this bush, right? But there is a lack of precision there, right? But we've talked about that. What about when it comes to small quantities? So let me set up an experiment for you. This was done on an island with free-ranging macaques, rhesus macaques, so these are monkeys, and these monkeys have been in several kinds of cognitive experiments, but they're free-ranging. Okay, so a researcher comes out and kneels between two different boxes and adds a set of apples to one box, one apple at a time, and then adds a second set to the remaining box, one apple at a time. So there's a different number of apples in each box. The experimenter then walks away from the box and towards the camera person and waits with the camera person, so they're recording what the monkeys are going to do, and then allowing the monkeys to come make a choice. Okay, so what did they find? Now, what we've previously said is that Weber's law is adhered to, so we might expect the same thing happens, right? So the monkey's ability to reliably choose the box with more apples would fit with Weber's law. So success is going to be dependent on the ratio difference, right? But that wasn't exactly what happened here. So in this task, monkeys' behavior depended on the size of the sets. So they chose the box hiding the larger amount of apples when the box is held, for example, 1 versus 2, so you can see that here, or 2 versus 3, or 2 versus 4, which you can see on the bottom. In these scenarios, the monkeys choose the greater amounts of apples. But they didn't have an easy time figuring out which box had more apples when they contained 2 versus 5, depicted there, or 3 versus 5. So the 2 to 5 ratio, 2 apples versus 5 apples, should be more discriminable than 2 versus 4 apples, right? But the monkeys succeed on 2 versus 4 more than they do 3 versus 5. Okay, so what is this? What is this phenomenon? So when discriminating between small quantities, performance is determined by the size of the arrays, and this is known as set size signature. Try saying that 5 times fast. So comparisons in which one of the sets is greater than 4 are difficult for the monkeys to make. So some number discriminations don't conform to Weber's law. Even though larger ratios should be more discernible, they're not. So some discriminations rely on total set size. So like I said, when one of the sets is greater than 4, it's difficult to do. So again, the total set for 2 versus 5, that's what actually makes that task more difficult, not the absolute ratio. When 12-month-old infants are performed on a similar kind of task, appropriate for infants, of course, they perform similarly to the rhesus monkeys. So again, the size of the sets was more important here. When we look outside of primates too, we find a kind of similar behavior. So it's been shown in salamanders, in fruit flies, and in domestic chicks, in arrays of dots, as long as the sets remained to be 3 or fewer. In contrast, though, in a species of mongoose lemurs, they found discrimination between small numbers was dependent on Weber's law. So Lebers are prosimians, so those are primates that split from the common ancestor to monkeys and apes and humans. They actually did have the discrimination between small numbers be dependent on Weber's law. Now, your textbook kind of talks about how this might be more of a experimental task situation than an actual difference in cognitive ability. So again, it's always important to question what is the task that you're implementing actually measuring in these types of experiments. Most of the evidence, though, does seem to show that there is this difference when it comes to small numbers, and that set size is important. Okay, so researchers generally have a consensus that there are different mechanisms for our approximate number system and our small number system. And one proposed mechanism for our small number system is known as an object tracking system. So here it's not specifically for number, but just for tracking objects, and it seems to have a limit of 4 objects. You can kind of think of this idea as the same as how in working memory there seems to be this capacity plus or minus 2 around 7, right? Kind of the same idea here. There's a limit of 4 objects in our object tracking system. And that corresponds to that set size limit seen in the studies that we talked about, which was around 4, right? Even though we're talking about object tracking, the object tracking system still provides a basis for comparisons between numbers. Right, so both used for object tracking and for approximate number. Now, in contrast, some say that it's the same system for small number and large number. There's just one system of analog number representations. It's simply that the system is primarily effective in situations where the ratio difference is large, and for smaller ratios, the output of an object tracking system will dominate. Okay, now let's talk about operations, or operating procedures on numbers. So a true concept of number should include an understanding that number is an ordered system, so that not only that, let's say, 2 and 4 are different quantities, but that 4 is larger than 2, right? So there's an order. In terms of non-human animals, operations can underlie foraging behavior, which we've talked about a little bit, but it's particularly useful when foraging decisions are based on sensitivity to the rate at which site provides food, which we will talk about when we talk about decision making next week. Okay, so addition and subtraction, is it dependent on language? We do write out symbolic representations with Arabic numerals, and same thing with adding and subtracting, right? The plus sign and minus sign. But there are potentially nonverbal numeric representations of addition and subtraction too. So in one example with infants, so a lot of work, is done with infants because they have some of the same challenges, and we talk about them in animal cognition because it has some of those same challenges with animals, right? Because we can't just ask them. We have to design experiments to kind of get at the question. So some researchers looked at infants, and what they did was they showed one doll being placed on a stage, and then an occluding screen was placed in front of the doll. Then a second doll was placed on the stage, also behind the screen. When they lifted the screen, they'd either show one doll or 2 dolls. Okay, so 1 plus 1 equals 1, or 1 plus 1 equals 2. And infants looked longer at the impossible outcome, so 1 plus 1 equals 1. And the same thing happened when they were subtracting. The infants again looked longer at the impossible situation. So this is, of course, an example in human infants. But when we look at research from monkeys, lemurs, and pigeons, we can find that they also have some of these non-verbal representations of addition and subtraction. So animals have also shown the ability to add and subtract in studies where looking time to possible and impossible events is measured. So rhesus macaques, for example, took longer when impossible addition and subtraction outcomes were revealed, both when the quantities were small, so for example, 1 plus 1 equals 3, being impossible, and large, 4 plus 4 equals 4. Another concept when it comes to number is ordinality. Now, you might remember from a research methods course or a statistics course different kinds of scales when it comes to number. So the first we can think of as a nominal scale, and that's kind of just like a label. So a nominal scale does not allow for any inferences to be made about relative magnitude. So think like Jersey numbers. A Jersey number of 99 is not greater than a Jersey number of 11, right? They're just labels. But on an ordinal scale, numbers are ordered in a rank based on their relative magnitude, right? And what we generally find is that a wide range of animal species can order as well and have a concept of ordering. So before we get into this last little section, I just want to say in sum that we know that a wide range of animal species can discriminate between numerosities, but can also add, subtract, and order. One kind of research that some people might be curious about is if animals can use Arabic numerals, the kinds of numerals we use. And we do know that animals can pair numbers with symbolic representation, so like literally the number 1, the number 2, the number 3, they can pair those things together. And we know that through a variety of touchscreen tasks or search tasks. But something I'd like to leave you thinking about is this really that interesting to study? Okay, we know that animals can pair numerals with quantities, but that isn't really telling us a whole lot about their own cognition, right? Sure, we can train them to pair these two stimuli together and kind of have perhaps some kind of representation of what that means, but it doesn't really tell us a whole lot about their own cognition, right? It's the same kind of thing when we talk about training animals to use sign language, which we'll talk about when we talk about communication. Okay. But to end the lecture today, I want to end on thinking about language and number and counting. So in English, at least, we know that our language allows for infinite enumeration. So we can easily say any number that we want, and then we can talk about adding them, subtracting them, performing operations on those numbers, right? We can talk about that through our language. But the languages of some other cultures don't have the same kinds of words available to them. So they might just have words for 1, for 2, and then for many, right? So these kinds of languages actually offer us a unique opportunity to examine relationships between number, cognition, and between language. So when we have language to describe numbers larger than 4 or 5, we do find that arithmetic tasks with numbers like that, greater than 4 or 5, are easier when we have words to describe them. So looking at cross-cultural work kind of helps support the claim that there's an approximate number system that is shared between humans and many animal species, and it doesn't necessarily rely on language because some cultures don't have the words for those types of numbers, right? But it does kind of lead to the question, which came first then? Was it a number system or was it our language?